The International Court of Justice, the world's highest court, has ordered Israel to immediately halt its military operations in Rafah, the last part of Gaza, which has not been reduced to near total destruction, where most of Gaza's pre-war population was forced to flee by the Israeli state as it laid waste to their homes, their schools, their hospitals, their universities, their mosques, their churches, their roads, their ancient monuments. The order is against its military offensive, as well as any other action in the Rafah governorate, which may inflict on the Palestinian group in Gaza conditions that could bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. In succinct terms, that is genocide. They voted 13-2, with one of their judges voting against because they have a blanket opposition to any involvement by international law in conflicts they define as political disputes, the other being Israel's own judge. Now, let's listen to the president of the court as he issued this provisional order, brought as a result, of course, of South Africa's general case against Israel for the crime of genocide.
The court considers that, in conformity with its obligations under the Genocide Convention, Israel must immediately halt its military offensive and any other action in the Rafah governorate which may inflict on the Palestinian group in Gaza conditions of life that could bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part.
The ICJ judgment notes that the situation has deteriorated since its first provisional orders back at the end of January, and that the humanitarian situation in Gaza is now disastrous.
As stated in its order of January 26, 2024, was at serious risk of deteriorating, has deteriorated, and has done so even further since the court adopted its order of March 28, 2024. In this regard, the court observes that the concern that it expressed in its decision communicated to the parties on February 16, 2024, with respect to the developments in Rafah have materialized, and that the humanitarian situation is now to be characterized as disastrous.
The ICJ also ordered Israel to allow a UN fact-finding mission in Gaza. Note how Israel has prevented international journalists and independent agencies, analysts from entering, and ordered Israel to open the Rafah crossing, which is the main means which humanitarian aid, not least food, can enter Gaza. Israel's done everything it can to stop that aid getting in and reaching the people who need it. And closing the Rafah crossing has simply accelerated this humanitarian catastrophe. Let's have a listen.
The court wishes to emphasize that the measure indicated in paragraph 51(2)(a) of its order of March 28, 2024, requiring, I quote, the unhindered provision at scale by all concerned of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance, end of quote, necessitates that the respondent maintain open land crossing points, and in particular the Rafah crossing.
It's worth noting the written contribution of Judge Dyer Clady. He says there are no more words to describe the horrors in Gaza. The words apocalyptic, exceptionally grave, disastrous and catastrophic have all been used to describe the current situation, and all seem to pale in comparison to what is unfolding before our very eyes. Almost daily we are confronted with gut-wrenching accounts of victims and survivors and images of unimaginable suffering. That this is happening in an age in which international law has been said to have matured into a much more socially conscious legal order is simply incongruous. They add that the court has today, in explicit terms, ordered the state of Israel to halt its offensive in Rafah. Now, what does this all mean in practice? Well, Israel's tried to twist the meaning of the order based on linguistic ambiguity, with fiery denunciations of South Africa in their statement, and claiming Israel has not and will not conduct military actions in the Rafah area, which may inflict on the Palestinian civilian population in Gaza conditions of life that could bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Yes, well, in other words, what they're doing is disregarding the facts of the total horror unleashed against Gaza's people as described in the ICJ's own statement, in support of the order, in favour, of course, in this case by Israel, of this distortion. Now, we all know what Israel's response in general will be. Indeed, within minutes of the order, Israel was pummeling houses in central Rafah with missiles, which is an answer in itself. Israel has wantonly flouted the previous ICJ orders, not least on facilitating access to humanitarian aid, This, of course, being a key plank of the ICC chief prosecutor's request for arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his Defence Minister Yoav Gallant for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Now, the ICJ order comes on top of those ICC arrest warrant requests, as well as more European nations recognising the state of Palestine. Never in all the decades since Israel was founded in 1948 has the state faced such a week of bitter international rejection. Well, Israel's leaders and cheerleaders should know that far worse is to come. This is the behaviour of a rogue state. I don't even see how anyone can credibly rebut that. Predictably, Israel responded to all that with smears, lies, deflections, as they have done in response, of course, to this ruling now. A recurring theme is abusing the grave evil of anti-Semitism, the very real and always profoundly dangerous hatred of Jewish people. Now, the ICC was condemned as anti-Semitic by the likes of Benjamin Netanyahu, and now the ICJ has been condemned as anti-Semitic. Listen to this.
The reaction from the hardline finance minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who has called it irrelevant and he's dismissed the court as anti-Semitic. These are the sorts of remarks you would expect.
This is vile as an attempt to evade accountability for monstrous crimes, of course, but it is also hideously irresponsible because it stops people believing in anti-Semitism being real, which it is, and that's dangerous. But as much as Israel screeches, all of this does actually have consequences. Let's just listen to this analyst on Al Jazeera.
Israel has to comply with this, but the second part of it is Israel will not. We know how Israel operates. We know there are numerous Security Council resolutions that Israel has not complied with. I have no expectation that Israel is going to suddenly put Prime Minister Netanyahu on television in an hour and say we're ending the Rafah offensive, which means that this court has done its bit, but this court has no enforcement power whatsoever in the UN system. The enforcement power goes back to New York, and it's then a question of the Security Council and the General Assembly, particularly the Security Council, because that has the power under the UN Charter to put in enforcement measures. If the Security Council decided it could send in an international force to make Israel do what it wants. So the pressure is on the Security Council, but in particular, the pressure is on the United States. Absolutely. We saw the outrage in the US earlier this week when the International Criminal Court, that's a separate court in The Hague, came up with recommendations from the prosecutor to then have to go to judges, that Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defence Minister Gallant should face arrest warrants for crimes against humanity and war crimes that have taken place in Gaza. It's harder for the US when it comes to this. This is the International Court of Justice. All member states must abide by this. And the US is saying the same thing as this court. The US for weeks has been saying the Rafah crossing must be open and there shouldn't be a Rafah offensive. The US doesn't disagree with this. So when someone brings this up in the Security Council, and I have no doubt that this will be the basis now of a resolution towards the Security Council, probably Algeria, they're the current Arab member of the Security Council. How is the US going to veto that?
Now, this is key. Pressure is being built on the Western nations, not least the US, who arm Israel and offer it aid and diplomatic and political support. Let's listen to this Sky News correspondent in Jerusalem.
2022, I think, ICJ ruling on Russia and Ukraine, the Americans, the White House, and at the time, the President, Joe Biden, was very supportive of the court in that instance. Can they really find themselves now, 2 years later, objecting to the court and trying to undermine it? It's going to put the White House in a very difficult position as well.
Well, here's the problem. The international order has clearly long been rigged in favour of the global north, despite pretences, but clearly there are some checks and balances to prevent a total descent into complete bloody anarchy. What Israel's cheerleaders are doing is setting fire to all of that, all in the name of protecting Israel from accountability for its monstrous crimes. It's in this context that the global south is flexing its muscles, as we've seen South Africa do so effectively throughout this whole process. Now, given President Joe Biden was forced to speak out against the Rafah offensive, he said that this would be the red line and then the US would withdraw weapons. Thanks to political pressure, I should say, brought by the movement against Israel's genocide, this all puts him in an extremely difficult position. How can he take on the ICJ over something he himself was forced to warn about? We should be clear. The ICJ order is legally binding. Israel should, as I've said, be treated for what it is. It's a rogue state. Arms transfers to Israel should surely be ruled illegal in such circumstances. There needs to be sanctions against Israel. Now, if this wasn't a state ally to the West, all of that would just be treated as a statement of the obvious. If you take together the ICJ's rulings and the ICC chief prosecutor's request for arrest warrants, the overall picture is gruesomely clear. This is one of the great crimes of our age. That was obvious from the very start, and everybody who backed this and legitimised it will be damned from history. You were warned from the start, and you refused to listen. Israeli leaders made it clear from the very beginning what they were going to do. They left no room whatsoever for interpretation of their statements, no ambiguity, as they promised to unleash some of the worst crimes of our age, and then spent around 8 months every single day committing virtually every crime under the sun. We cannot let them get away with this. We have to hold them to account. Not just Israel's own leaders, but Western politicians and media outlets and commentators, not just for justice, but to stop these horrors repeating themselves over and over again. Please like and subscribe. Do leave your comments. Do help us take on the Pro War Media as ever at patreon.com/OJ84. We've got lots of interviews and material on this to come with thanks to you. Listen to the podcast. I'll speak to you soon.